Coronavirus. How much will it cost the UK and how will we pay? This is an article by Ben King, business reporter for BBC News. With much of the UK under lockdown, many shops, pubs and restaurants are shut and large parts of the economy are effectively closed. The government has spent hundreds of billions on measures to support businesses and jobs and fight the pandemic. But how will it pay for these? How much will coronavirus cost the UK? You won't know how big the final bill will be until after the crisis is over, but the government will certainly have to borrow enormous amounts of money because it is spending more than it is taking in from tax. On the 25th of November, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, which keeps tabs on government spending, estimated that borrowing would be £394 billion for the current financial year, April 2020 to April 2021. That's the highest figure ever seen outside wartime. To put that cost into context, before the crisis, the government was expecting to borrow about £55 billion for the whole financial year. Well, in my estimates, that means coronavirus has cost us, approximately, 55 billion less 94 billion. I don't know. My mind's not working. But, well over 300 billion coronavirus has cost us, and not the amount previously stated. That's the highest figure ever seen outside wartime. To put that into context, before the crisis, the government was expecting to borrow about 55 billion for the whole financial year. So the government is still borrowing and will always borrow and continue to borrow. Government borrowing has soared this year to 214.9 billion. Why does the pandemic mean the government has to borrow more? This year, the government is spending a staggering 280 billion on measures to fight COVID-19 and its impact on the economy. That includes 73 billion for measures to support jobs such as the furlough scheme where the government pays most of the wages of employees who cannot work. Can I go on furlough and how much will I be paid? The National Health Service and other public services have been given £127 billion extra to combat the pandemic, and £66 billion will be spent on grants and loans to support businesses. The government will also raise £100 billion less tax than it hoped because of the crisis. Unemployed or furloughed workers pay less income tax, businesses pay less tax if their profits are lower, and shoppers pay less VAT if they buy fewer things. With more money going out and less coming in, the government has only one option: to borrow. Well, I don't think they have one option, they have two. And one is to borrow and one is to establish a resource-based economy. But we won't go into that right now. We'll go into this report from the BBC. Will I have to pay more tax? Some economists argue that all the costs of the crisis could be covered by borrowing alone, but many disagree. Well, the obvious thing to me there is that if you borrow money, taxes will rise anyway to pay back for the borrowing. But anyway, there's nothing to disagree about, really, is there? If the government wants to get borrowing down, it will have to cut spending or raise taxes, or most likely both. Raising taxes would be politically awkward because the Conservative 2019 manifesto promised not to raise the three biggest taxes. These are income tax, national insurance and VAT. And together they bring in more than half of the government's revenue. Increasing taxes means people have less money to spend, which could slow down the economy further. However, the respected Institute for Fiscal Studies think tank has warned that tax rises of more than 40 billion a year are all but inevitable. Cutting spending will also be difficult. There have been big cuts over the past decade, and many of the easy savings have already been made. Some areas have long been protected, such as the National Health Service, and it will be difficult to reduce health spending after a pandemic. State pensions, another big spending item, are protected by so-called triple lock, which guarantees they rise with wages, prices, or a 2.5% every year, whichever is the highest. The manifesto promises to keep this too. In Wednesday's spending review, the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, did make some cuts, such as freezing pay for many public sector workers. He also cut the amount the UK will spend on overseas aid, despite a manifesto pledge to keep it at 0.7% of the national income. How will the spending review affect you? The Chancellor could say the pandemic also makes other manifesto promises impossible to keep, but difficult choices will have to be made. So how will this affect my life? If taxes go up, people will soon realise they have less money to spend. Likewise, people will notice if lower public spending results in worse public services, such as longer waiting times in hospitals or fewer police on the streets. Public sector workers whose wages are frozen will feel that impact very keenly. And if pensions or benefits are cut, or even just increase less rapidly, that will be felt directly by anyone who depends on them. How will the money be raised? At first, the government will raise money by borrowing from investors. They could be individuals, companies, pension funds, or foreign governments who lend money to the UK government by buying bonds. Where does the government borrow billions from? A bond is a promise to pay the money back in the future and pay interest on the loan in the meantime. The Bank of England is buying huge amounts of bonds. to support the economy by encouraging more spending and investment in a process called quantitative easing. This year, the bank is buying £450 billion worth of bonds, which makes it much easier for the government to borrow money. So, the Bank of England is buying £450 billion worth of bonds with money that they print out of thin air and call it quantitative easing. What is quantitative easing? Can the UK afford all this debt? In recent years, the government has been able to borrow easily at a very low interest rate, which makes its debt more affordable. At the moment, it pays just 0.32% interest to borrow for 10 years. There is a limit how much the government can borrow before interest payments become so great it can't afford them. No one quite knows where that limit is. I wonder why. But those interest payments will still weigh on future generations until the debt is paid off, and will mean there is less money available to spend on public services or tax cuts. So that means we're paying everybody, paying the bankings, the Bank of England, all our taxes to keep the Bank of England and their employees employed in a system which perpetuates their existence. I suppose that's it, really, isn't it? That's the cost so far of coronavirus. A staggering £280 billion. But if we'd been in a resource-based economy, the cost would have been zero.